I knew something was wrong before I even reached the property line. The first clue wasn't the giant gate or the security cameras, or even the brand new asphalt road cutting across what used to be open pasture. It was the feeling in my gut, that strange feeling you get when you're looking at something familiar and realizing it isn't familiar anymore. 3 years earlier, I'd left my family's ranch in the hands of a trusted foreman so I could move nearly 2,000 miles away and care for my grandmother during the final years of her life. 3 years later, I came home and found a luxury golf resort sitting on land that still legally belonged to me. My name is Ethan Harper. I'm 49 years old, and until all this happened, I thought land theft was something that happened in old Western movies, not modern America. My family had owned that ranch outside Pine Creek, Oklahoma, for generations. My great-grandfather bought the original acreage with money he earned hauling cattle across the state. My grandfather expanded it. My father spent 40 years turning it into one of the most respected cattle operations in the county. Every fence post, every pond, every patch of grass carried a memory. I learned to ride horses there before I learned to drive. I proposed to my wife beside the old oak tree near the south pasture. I buried my first dog on that property. To most people, it was 35 acres of ranch land. To me, it was family history written into the soil. Then life happened all at once. My father passed away after a short battle with cancer. 6 months later, my grandmother's health collapsed. She lived alone in northern Idaho, and there wasn't anybody else who could care for her full-time. I remember sitting at my kitchen table staring at maps, legal paperwork, medical reports, trying to figure out how one man could be in two places at once. Eventually, I did what family does. I packed my truck, hired a management company to assist my foreman, kept paying taxes, insurance, utilities, and maintenance expenses, and moved north. I never planned to stay away 3 years. It just happened. Anyone who has cared for an aging relative understands how quickly time disappears. One doctor's appointment becomes 10. 1 month becomes a year. Then suddenly several years have slipped through your fingers. During that time, I never sold anything. Never listed the ranch. Never entertained offers. I received occasional updates from the foreman about fencing repairs, water systems, and cattle leases. Nothing seemed unusual. Property taxes remained current. Legal ownership remained in my name. Everything looked normal from a distance. Then in August of 2023, after my grandmother passed peacefully at 92, I finally headed home. I remember being excited the entire drive. I was already planning projects in my head. Replace the old barn roof. Rebuild the cattle pens. Maybe spend a few months fishing and breathing again. The closer I got, the happier I felt. Then I turned onto County Road 18, and everything changed. At first, I thought I had taken a wrong turn. There was a stone entrance where none had ever existed. Massive decorative walls stretched across both sides of the road. Perfect landscaping surrounded a wrought iron gate. A sign illuminated by expensive lighting read Silver Ridge Country Club. I actually laughed. I thought some developer must have built near my property while I was gone. Then I looked closer. The gate was sitting exactly where my southern fence line should have been. I pulled over, checked the GPS, checked it again. My pulse started climbing. Beyond the gate, I could see golf carts moving across rolling green fairways. There were artificial lakes, sand traps, luxury homes in the distance, and a clubhouse larger than some hotels I'd stayed in. The entire scene looked like something from a real estate commercial. The problem was I knew exactly what used to be there. That wasn't a golf course. That was my pasture. 80 head of cattle used to graze there every spring. I sat in my truck staring through the windshield for what felt like 10 minutes. Finally, I drove to the gate and pressed the call button. A young security guard answered. I told him I owned the property and needed the gate opened. The kid actually chuckled. "Sir," he said, "members use the north entrance. Deliveries use the service road." I said, "No, you don't understand. This is my land." There was a long silence. Then he asked me to wait while he contacted management. Looking back now, that conversation feels almost funny. At the time, it felt like the beginning of a nightmare. Because standing there, staring at a luxury golf course that shouldn't have existed, I had absolutely no idea that the next phone call was about to reveal a fraud scheme worth millions of dollars. A few minutes later, my phone rang. The woman on the other end introduced herself as Victoria Langford, president of Silver Ridge Community Association. Her voice carried that polished confidence people develop when they're used to getting their way. Before I could say much, she said, "Mr. Harper, I understand there's some confusion regarding ownership, but Silver Ridge legally acquired that land in 2021. We have recorded documents and title insurance. For a second, I honestly thought she had the wrong person. I said, "Ma'am, I've owned that ranch since my father died. Nobody has ever purchased anything from me." She paused, not because she believed me, but because she thought I was mistaken. Then she said something that sent a chill straight through me. "Mr. Harper, according to our records, you personally signed the sale agreement." I can still remember staring at the steering wheel when she said it. Sign what agreement? Sold what land? To whom? Victoria promised to email copies of the documents immediately. 20 minutes later, I was sitting in my truck looking at PDFs that supposedly proved I had sold 26 acres of my ranch 2 years earlier. There was my name. There was a signature. There was a notary seal. There was even a closing statement showing a purchase price of nearly $1 million. The only problem was none of it was real. The signature looked like someone had glanced at my driver's license once and then tried to recreate it from memory. It wasn't even close. By sunset, I was sitting in the office of my longtime attorney, Randall Pierce, a man who had represented my family for nearly 20 years. Randall spent less than 30 seconds studying the documents before leaning back in his chair. "Ethan," he said quietly, "either somebody made a terrible mistake or somebody committed a very expensive crime." The following week became a blur of paperwork, investigations, phone calls, and growing disbelief. Randall ordered a complete title search. What we discovered looked less like a property transaction and more like a carefully constructed theft. According to county records, a company called Horizon Land Ventures had somehow acquired my 26 acres through a private sale. Less than 60 days later, the company sold the same property to developer Gregory Vaughn. Vaughn then flipped it to Silver Ridge Community Association for nearly 4 times the original price. The profit margin alone was staggering. Somebody had made millions. As we dug deeper, the story became even uglier. The notary stamp used during the transaction belonged to a woman who had retired years before the sale allegedly occurred. The phone number listed on several closing documents led nowhere. The witness signatures appeared inconsistent. And perhaps most importantly, on the exact day I supposedly attended the closing in Oklahoma, my bank records showed purchases at a grocery store in Idaho. Security footage from the store still existed. Medical records proved I had accompanied my grandmother to an appointment that afternoon. I wasn't at a closing table. I wasn't even in the same state. That's when Randall stopped treating it like a civil dispute and started treating it like organized fraud. He contacted county investigators, then state authorities. Then federal agencies became interested because electronic transfers connected multiple states. What started as a property disagreement suddenly involved identity theft, forged documents, wire transfers, fraudulent real estate transactions, and potentially conspiracy charges. Meanwhile, life inside Silver Ridge continued as if nothing was wrong. Golf tournaments were being hosted on my land. Weddings were taking place inside the clubhouse built on my land. Membership fees were being collected from facilities operating on my land. Every day that passed made me angrier. Not because of the money, because somebody had taken years of family history and treated it like a business opportunity. One afternoon, I finally met Victoria Langford in person. We sat across from each other in a conference room overlooking the 18th hole. Through the windows, I could see golfers laughing while carts rolled across what used to be my grazing fields. Victoria folded her hands and said, "Mr. Harper, we're victims here as well. We purchased this property in good faith." I looked out the window for a few seconds before answering. "Maybe you did. Maybe you didn't. But while everybody else was making money, my family's land disappeared." She sighed. "The golf course already exists. Hundreds of homeowners depend on these amenities." I nodded slowly. "And that's unfortunate." She blinked. "What does that mean?" I leaned forward. "It means if the federal government concludes this land never legally changed ownership, then every fairway, every clubhouse event, every dollar collected here happened on property you didn't own." The room got very quiet after that. A few days later, federal investigators started issuing subpoenas. Bank records surfaced. Emails surfaced. Closing communications surfaced. The picture became clearer with every document. Gregory Vaughn wasn't an innocent buyer caught in the middle. Investigators believed he knew exactly what he was doing. Evidence suggested a participant had impersonated me during the fraudulent closing. Someone had pretended to be Ethan Harper. Someone had signed documents under my name. Someone had helped move the land through multiple transactions quickly enough to make recovery difficult. The more evidence investigators uncovered, the more nervous people became. Then came the moment everything exploded. Early one Tuesday morning, I received a phone call from Randall. His tone sounded different. Calm, but satisfied. "Turn on the news," he said. That's all he said. I grabbed the remote and switched on the local station. There on the screen stood Gregory Vaughn being escorted out of his office in handcuffs. Reporters crowded around him while federal agents guided him toward an SUV. The headline underneath practically wrote itself. Local developer arrested in multi-million-dollar property fraud investigation. I won't lie to you. Watching that footage felt good. Not because I enjoy seeing people arrested. I don't. But because for the first time since arriving home, I knew I wasn't crazy. I knew I wasn't imagining things. Somebody had stolen my property, and finally somebody was being held accountable. What I didn't realize yet was that the arrest would trigger complete panic inside Silver Ridge, because the HOA board was about to discover that proving they had been fooled didn't automatically protect them from what came next. The legal battle was only entering its most expensive phase, and before it was over, the people who built an entire luxury community on my ranch would be writing checks they never imagined possible. Within days of Gregory Vaughn's arrest, the mood inside Silver Ridge changed so dramatically it almost felt like an entirely different place. The confidence was gone. The polished press statements disappeared. The aggressive legal letters stopped showing up. Suddenly, the people who had spent months insisting everything was legitimate wanted conversations. Real conversations. The first call came from Victoria Langford late on a Thursday afternoon. Her voice sounded different than it had during our first conversation at the gate. Back then she sounded certain. Now she sounded tired. Careful. Nervous. "Ethan," she said, "I think it's time we discuss a resolution." I remember looking out across the pasture behind my house and thinking about how strange those words sounded after everything that had happened. Resolution. As if this were some misunderstanding between neighbors over a fence line. As if someone hadn't stolen a piece of my family's history and turned it into a luxury development. Still, I agreed to meet. Not because I trusted them, but because I wanted to hear what they had to say. The meeting took place inside the clubhouse itself, the same building that stood where my father's cattle once gathered near a watering pond. Walking through those doors was surreal. Richwood paneling, chandeliers, a restaurant packed with people laughing over lunch, framed photographs showing the development's grand opening. Everywhere I looked, I saw reminders that somebody else's dream had been built on top of my family's land. At one point, I stopped in front of a large aerial photograph hanging in the hallway. A board member standing nearby smiled proudly and said, "Beautiful property, isn't it?" I looked at him and answered, "Yeah, my grandfather thought so too." The smile vanished immediately. The negotiations dragged on for months. Every week brought new meetings, new reports, new calculations. Teams of accountants examined years of financial records. Consultants estimated revenue generated from memberships, tournaments, weddings, private events, restaurant operations, sponsorship agreements, and property value increases linked directly to the golf course. The deeper everyone looked, the bigger the numbers became. What shocked me most wasn't how much money had been made. It was how many people had benefited while never once questioning whether the original transaction was legitimate. Somewhere along the line, everybody simply assumed the paperwork must be real because enough people had signed it. That's a dangerous assumption. Randall said something during one meeting that stuck with me. One of the HOA attorneys argued that Silver Ridge had been deceived just like everyone else. Randall nodded and said, "That may be true, but being fooled doesn't erase responsibility. If someone unknowingly rents a stolen car for 3 years, they're still driving a stolen car." The room got very quiet after that. Nobody really had an answer. Around the same time, federal prosecutors continued tightening their case against Vaughn. New evidence surfaced almost weekly. Emails, wire transfers, recorded communications, testimony from people involved in the transactions. Investigators eventually discovered that the fraud hadn't been a spur-of-the-moment decision. It had been planned, carefully planned. There had been fake identities, fake documentation, manipulated records, and a deliberate effort to move ownership through multiple entities quickly enough to create confusion. Every layer investigators peeled back revealed another layer underneath. One evening, Randall called me after reviewing newly released court filings. Remember when you asked how someone could be bold enough to steal 26 acres? He said. I do. He laughed quietly. Turns out they weren't stealing land. They were stealing time. They thought by the time anyone figured it out, the development would be too big to undo. That sentence hit me harder than anything else. Because he was right. The plan wasn't really about convincing people they owned the land forever. The plan was to build so much, invest so much money, create so much dependency, that reversing the fraud would become impossible. In a twisted way, it was brilliant. And if I had stayed in Idaho another few years, it might have worked. Eventually, the criminal case reached its conclusion. Vaughn accepted a plea agreement. The details became public almost immediately. Local newspapers covered every development. Television stations ran special reports. People who had never met me suddenly recognized my name in grocery stores. Some treated me like a folk hero. Others thought I was being too aggressive. One man at a gas station actually told me I should just sell the property and move on. I asked him how he'd feel if somebody forged his signature, sold his house, made millions, and expected him to quietly walk away. He didn't have much to say after that. The final settlement negotiations happened over 2 long days. I don't think anyone slept much. By that point, both sides understood the reality. A lengthy court battle could drag on for years and potentially destroy everyone involved. The agreement that finally emerged was complicated, but the outcome was simple. Silver Ridge would pay for the privilege of continuing to operate on land it never legally owned. They would compensate for years of unauthorized commercial use. They would cover damages. They would accept strict enforcement provisions. They would acknowledge my ownership rights. And they would do all of it under terms strong enough to prevent future games. When the final documents were placed on the conference table, nobody celebrated. There were no smiles, no handshakes for photographs, just exhausted people signing papers and accepting reality. I signed my name last. A real signature this time. Funny how much power there is in something as simple as signing your own name after spending years fighting a forged version of it. A few weeks later, I returned to the ranch alone. No attorneys, no reporters, no investigators. Just me. I walked out toward the old southern pasture around sunset. The air smelled like fresh-cut grass. Somewhere in the distance, I could hear golfers finishing a late round. I stopped near a section of fence that had survived all the construction and sat there watching the sky turn orange. That's when I found myself thinking about my father again. Not the day he died. Not the funeral. Just ordinary memories. Fixing fences together. Feeding cattle. Long drives across dusty roads. The things that seem small until they're all you have left. For years, I thought the fight was about land. Looking back, it wasn't. The land mattered, sure. But what really mattered was refusing to let somebody erase the truth. Because once people discover they can rewrite reality without consequences, they'll keep doing it. Maybe that's why this story resonated with so many people around town. It wasn't really about property law or real estate fraud. It was about accountability. It was about whether power and money should be allowed to replace facts. It was about whether ordinary people still have a chance when someone with resources decides to take what isn't theirs. Today, the payments continue arriving exactly as required. The agreement remains active. The ranch remains mine. The golf course remains where it is. And every time I drive past that entrance, I can't help wondering how many similar situations never get uncovered. How many owners never come back? How many forged signatures never get questioned? How many lies survive simply because nobody looks closely enough? That's the thought that stays with me. Not the money. Not the settlement. Not even the victory. The thought that if I had arrived home 6 months later, or a year later, this entire story might have ended very differently. So now I want to ask you something. If you were in my position, would you have accepted the settlement and moved forward? Or would you have pushed to shut the entire development down no matter how many families were affected? And if Silver Ridge truly didn't know the land was stolen, should they still be responsible for every dollar they earned from it? Drop your thoughts in the comments because people around here still argue about that question, and honestly, after everything that happened, I'm not sure there will ever be an answer everyone agrees on.